Hi viewers, welcome back to Silent Case, where forgotten timelines speak and buried truths finally surface. Here, every file is more than a story, it's a scar. Every clue breathes, every silence hides a name. On Silent Case, we uncover the truths the world chose to ignore, and the echoes time refused to erase. Today's case reaches back almost half a century to a disappearance that reshaped an entire town. In 1974, a mother and her young son vanished without a trace, and for decades their names were sealed in silence, until now, because a hidden church ledger has finally revealed what the town of Brackenridge never wanted anyone to see. So let's go back to the night when everything began. On the night of September 14th, 1974, Brackenridge lay under a low ceiling of fog, the kind that swallowed sound and softened the glow of porch lamps until the whole town looked half erased. Residents would later recall it as a quiet night, but that quiet was deceptive. Something shifted in the dark hours after midnight, something that would fracture the town's history for decades. At 11:47 p.m., according to the Ward family's aging mantel clock, Eleanor Ward stepped out onto her porch. She was 38, a widow for nearly 4 years, and known for her soft voice and unwavering devotion to her son, Caleb. Neighbors remembered her as gentle, but never fragile, a woman who survived hard winters and harder rumors. Yet that night, she moved with an urgency no one could explain. Inside the house, a lamp glowed through the thin curtains. Caleb, only 8 years old, shuffled out with his small backpack already zipped. What he carried inside would become a point of speculation for investigators decades later. His shoes were untied, his hair flattened on one side from sleep. Eleanor crouched to fix his laces, her fingers trembling. A single witness, though she didn't come forward until many years later, recalled seeing Eleanor kneel there, whispering something to her son. The witness described it as a mother's final promise, a quiet, desperate assurance that everything would be okay. By 12:03 a.m., the two were walking down the narrow dirt path leading away from their farmhouse. No car engine, no packed suitcases, just a mother and child stepping into the fog. The sheriff's report would later claim Eleanor voluntarily left the property. But several details complicate that version of events. For one, neighbors on the ridge saw headlights near the Ward home shortly after the pair disappeared down the path. The vehicle sat with its lights off for nearly 10 minutes before pulling away slowly, as if waiting for someone. Another neighbor, an older man who rarely spoke to anyone, told his daughter years later that he heard something else, the sound of the church bells ringing long after midnight. St. Matthew's Chapel never rang its bells except during Sunday service and funerals. But that night, 3 slow tolls drifted across the valley. No record of that ringing exists in church logs. Investigators dismissed the reports as memory distortion, fog playing tricks on sound. But the people of Brackenridge never forgot it. At 12:19 a.m., a single porch light flicked on in the distance. Eleanor and Caleb were seen walking toward the direction of St. Matthew's, the last confirmed sighting. Beyond that point, the fog swallowed them whole. Later evidence showed the front door of the Ward farmhouse had been left unlocked. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the kitchen table, still faintly warm when deputies arrived. Caleb's favorite drawing a crude sketch of their house, and the pine trees remained taped to the fridge. Eleanor's purse and wallet were left behind. Nothing about the scene suggested travel, panic, or planning. Only one detail felt wrong, a faint scuff mark on the wooden floor, as though something heavy had been dragged or someone had slipped in haste. After the disappearance, townsfolk would whisper about Eleanor's visit to Pastor Whitford 2 days earlier. She had walked into his office carrying a sealed envelope. She left empty, handed and visibly shaken. When asked later, the pastor claimed she never visited at all, but the envelope was never found. Rumors began immediately, but answers never came. Brackenridge moved on, or tried to. What began as an unexplained mother and son departure would soon transform into the most haunting cold case in the county's history. And in the silence that followed their vanishing, one question echoed louder than the rest. Why were the church bells ringing that night? And why did no one admit to ringing them? By the time dawn broke over Brackenridge, the fog had thinned, revealing a town waking to the first whispers of unease. Word traveled faster than the sheriff's cruiser crawling up the ward driveway. A mother and her son were gone, no note, no trace, no reason. The official investigation began at 6:18 a.m., with Deputy Heron stepping onto the ward porch and finding the front door still ajar. Inside, the house remained exactly as Eleanor had left it, tea cooling in a ceramic cup, the lamp humming faintly, and Caleb's little jacket hanging neatly on a hook. All signs pointed to a sudden departure, but not a planned one. Sheriff Nolan, a stern man molded by the church, dominated politics of Brackenridge, filed the first report himself. His language was clinically detached. Subject appears to have left on foot voluntarily. Anyone who knew Eleanor found that impossible to believe. She had never gone anywhere without telling her sister, or at least leaving a note on the table. But the sheriff's version stuck, at least officially. Yet the inconsistencies began almost immediately. At 9:22 a.m., search teams combing the nearby forest found tire tracks near the rear fence of the ward property tracks from a vehicle heavier than any neighborhood car. The soil indicated the vehicle had sat idle for several minutes before pulling away toward the old St. Matthew's Chapel. Oddly, those tracks never made it into the final case file. 2 volunteers also reported finding small footprints near the tree line matching a child's size. But shortly after, Sheriff Nolan redirected all search activity away from the chapel grounds and toward the river instead. Official reasoning: high risk of accidental drowning. Privately, several volunteers suspected they were being kept away from church property. Still, the river search produced nothing: no clothing, no footprints, no signs of a struggle near the bank. Then came the first major anomaly. Eleanor's car, a pale blue Plymouth, was found abandoned behind the chapel. The keys were missing, the doors left unlocked. Every surface inside had been wiped clean, even the radio dial. The sheriff wrote it off as simple abandonment. Detectives from the county disagreed, but by the time they arrived 3 days later, the car had already been towed and professionally detailed. Who ordered the cleaning? No one claimed responsibility. Meanwhile, interviews raised more questions than answers. Most townspeople responded with polite concern, but something about their tone felt rehearsed, as if someone had warned them what to say. The church elders were the most guarded. Pastor Whitford told deputies he hadn't seen Eleanor in months, though multiple townspeople remembered her visiting him only days before she vanished. When pressed about it, he lifted a hand with gentle authority and replied, "People misremember things under stress." The sheriff accepted that explanation without hesitation, but behind closed doors, one officer wasn't convinced. Deputy Heron Young, observant, and not yet shaped by Brackenridge silence, scribbled a private note in the margins of his copy of the file. "He's lying. Check office logs." He never got the chance. Days later, that page of the file was torn out and replaced with a typed summary that included none of his concerns. Then came the strangest detail of all, one that never made it into any official report. A local farm hand claimed he saw a red backpack near the stone well behind the chapel on the morning after the disappearance. It looked like a child's, he said. When he returned, after informing deputies, it was gone. The sheriff later denied any such item was ever reported. The farm hand quietly moved away the next year. By the end of the second week, the investigation appeared thorough on paper, but hollow in reality. Leads were followed only until they brushed too close to church grounds. Witness statements were corrected, and any clue pointing toward foul play was buried under the persistent narrative that Elinor had simply wanted to leave. But something darker pulsed beneath the surface, a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The last entry in the original vanishing file, written in a shaky hand, reads, "Request to search chapel grounds denied. Higher authority involved." That line remains the most haunting timestamp in the case. Because it marked the moment the investigation stopped being about finding Elinor and Caleb and became about protecting something else. Brackenridge had always been a quiet place, but in the days following Elinor and Caleb's disappearance, that quiet hardened into something colder, a silence with weight, intention, and boundaries no one dared cross. For investigators, speaking to townspeople felt less like gathering testimonies and more like trying to decode a language built on avoidance. Deputy Heron sensed it first. Whenever he approached locals with a notebook in hand, conversations shut down with uncanny synchronization. Doors closed mid-sentence. Store owners suddenly remembered tasks in the back room. Even casual greetings vanished. People weren't just reluctant, they were afraid. The church bells rang again 3 days after the vanishing, a slow, deliberate toll that echoed through the valley. Heron noted the time, 4:11 p.m., the precise hour the sheriff held a closed-door meeting with the church elders. When Heron asked the pastor afterward why the bells had rung, Whitford simply smiled and said, "You must have imagined it." But the sound was real. Half the town had heard it. If the bells were a signal, no one admitted it. The deeper investigators pushed, the stranger the atmosphere became. At the Ward property, several neighbors remembered nothing, despite living close enough to hear a whisper through the trees. A woman who initially mentioned seeing headlights near the house recanted the next day, eyes darting toward the church steeple as she spoke. One elderly man claimed he couldn't risk saying more, though he wouldn't explain what that risk involved. Within a week, the sheriff shifted the investigation strategy. Rather than expanding the search perimeter, he reduced it, pulling teams away from the chapel, the forest trails, and the old well. He insisted they focus on the river, despite the lack of evidence. Privately, some deputies whispered that he wasn't leading the search, but limiting it. And then, pieces of the case file began to disappear. Heron discovered it first, a missing witness statement, the one reporting Caleb's red backpack by the well. Later, an incident log documenting tire tracks found behind the Ward property vanished from its folder. When Heron confronted Sheriff Nolan, the sheriff dismissed the issue with a tight smile. "Paperwork gets messy when emotions run high," he said. But Heron wasn't convinced. He began keeping his own private notes at home, away from the office. Just when the investigation seemed ready to collapse under its own contradictions, Elinor's sister, Martha Ward, arrived from Denver. Sharp, outspoken, and unwilling to be dismissed, Martha questioned every missed clue and every altered line in the case file. She brought with her the kind of grief that doesn't shrink, it sharpens. At first, the townspeople treated her with cautious sympathy. But when she asked too many questions about Elinor's meeting with Pastor Whitford, the town's warmth turned cool. Store clerks began ignoring her. Her motel room phone rang twice each night, no voice on the other end. The church elders refused to meet with her, claiming spiritual privacy. One evening, as Martha left the sheriff's office after yet another fruitless attempt to reopen the chapel search, she found a folded piece of paper under her car wiper. No handwriting, just typed words, "Stop asking about the ledger." She brought the note to Sheriff Nolan immediately, but he responded with a dismissive chuckle. "Pranks happen, Martha. Don't stir panic where there is none." But her hands were shaking when she folded the paper back into her coat pocket. Someone knew she was digging and wanted her to stop. As days stretched into weeks, Brackenridge's silence only deepened. People walked faster, spoke softer, and glanced at the church before answering even simple questions. The investigation had hit an invisible wall, and everyone seemed determined to keep it standing. But beneath that silence, pressure was building in the deputy who wouldn't give up. in Martha, who refused to be pushed out, and in the increasingly inconsistent stories leaking out of the church. Something in Brackenridge wasn't just hidden, it was being protected. By late autumn of 1974, the investigation had thinned to a fragile thread. Leads dried up, witnesses withdrew, and Brackenridge, once restless with unease, settled into a practiced stillness, as if the town had collectively agreed to bury the matter alongside the fallen leaves. Sheriff Nolan held a brief press gathering outside the courthouse on a gray November morning. He stood stiffly behind the podium, eyes fixed on pre-written statements rather than the small crowd before him. His announcement was clinical, almost rehearsed. With no evidence of foul play and no new leads, the ward disappearance will be reclassified as unresolved and inactive. It was the phrase he repeated twice, no evidence of foul play, that struck Deputy Heron like a slap. Evidence had existed. It simply never made it into the official files. Martha Ward stood at the back of the gathering, her face pale with disbelief. She had watched the investigation shrink day by day, constrained by invisible hands. Still, hearing the case declared cold felt like a betrayal not just of her sister, but of truth itself. When she confronted Nolan afterward, he spoke in the tone of someone delivering a final warning. "Let it rest, Martha. Sometimes people choose to leave." But Martha knew Elinor hadn't chosen anything, especially not to vanish without Caleb's favorite shoes still sitting by the door. By winter, search efforts ceased entirely. Volunteers stopped walking the forest trails. Flyers faded on telephone poles. The Ward farmhouse was boarded up by spring. Only Heron continued to dig in secret, copying fragments of statements, sketches of tire tracks, timelines, and notes that contradicted the sheriff's narrative. He stored them in a shoebox under his bed, a personal archive of truths the town refused to acknowledge. In 1975, the sheriff's office quietly transferred the Ward case file to the basement archives, boxed between two unrelated missing persons reports. The box was mislabeled. The index card read simply, "Closed, insufficient evidence." No mention of Elinor, no mention of Caleb. Even the church's involvement faded from public memory. St. Matthew's continued its Sunday rituals. The elders maintained their posture of serenity. Pastor Whitford delivered sermons about faith in uncertainty, his voice steady, his eyes unreadable. Martha, after months of battling silence, finally broke. She sold the Ward property, packed her belongings, and left Brackenridge. Her departure wasn't dramatic. It was quite a woman exhausted by fighting walls that would not move. But those who saw her last remembered the look in her eyes, not acceptance, but a promise. She swore she'd return when something, anything, surfaced. Years trickled by, people aged, new families moved in. The Ward case became a ghost story teenagers whispered about on warm nights. Some said Elinor drowned. Others claimed they'd seen strange lights at the chapel the week she disappeared. A few insisted the church elders knew more than they had ever admitted. But official history forgot her. Then, in 1999, something changed. During a routine reorganization of county records, an archivist named Rachel Klein found a dusty wooden box tucked behind obsolete tax documents. It wasn't labeled, and its hinges were rusted shut. When she pried it open, she found a thin folder marked with 3 handwritten words. Ward ledger restricted inside was nothing but an empty sleeve and faint dust patterns, suggesting another document had once been stored there. Rachel hesitated. Restricted files weren't supposed to be hidden, especially not without logging. She brought the box to her supervisor, who instructed her to leave it alone and return it where she found it. But Rachel didn't. She took a photo of the folder before locking the room for the night. That photo, years later, would find its way into the hands of an independent researcher, a man named Daniel Price. And that would be the spark that reopened everything. For almost 5 decades, the disappearance of Helen Ward and her 8-year-old son, Jacob, had sat in the county archives like a sealed wound, too old to bleed, yet too painful to forget. The previous chapter closed with the discovery of a name whispered in the town's forgotten corners, St. Bridget's, and while most believed the abandoned church had nothing left to give, Detective Mara Ellison knew better. Some structures, no matter how silent, still held echoes. 3 days after the old church ledger surfaced, Mara returned to the basement of the county courthouse where the original case file was kept. The room smelled of dust and paper that had absorbed decades of secrets. She pulled open a thin metal drawer labeled 1974 Missing Persons. Inside lay the Ward file, yellowed, brittle-edged, and held together by a rusted clip, as if the case itself resisted being disturbed. The moment she lifted the folder, a photograph slipped out and landed face down on the floor. She picked it up carefully. It showed Helen standing outside her small, white farmhouse with her son leaning into her side, smiling with the shy confidence of a boy who trusted the world. Mara held the picture a little too long. Something about it felt like a quiet plea. She set the photo aside and began reviewing the reports. The file was painfully thin for a case involving 2 vanished people. The initial search logs, barely 3 pages, mentioned a few volunteers combing the woods, rain interrupting the efforts, and then nothing. No follow-up statements, no interviews with neighbors, no canvassing records. Just a note scrawled at the bottom of the final page. Case closed due to lack of evidence. It was not an explanation. It was an escape. Mara flipped to the only eyewitness statement on file, a farmer named Alden Burrows, who'd claimed he saw Helen's car heading west that morning. His handwriting was sloppy, hurried, almost nervous, and now that the name St. Bridget's had resurfaced, his account seemed even stranger. The west road didn't lead to the church, it led away from it. Why lie about something so simple? Mara closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. The old cases she handled often contained gaps. People forgot, records faded. But this one had holes carved into it deliberately. Someone had trimmed the story until it barely resembled an investigation. And the more she thought about the ledger found inside the church, the one hinting at financial ties between prominent townspeople and the Ward family, the more she sensed that the disappearance had never been about a mother and son simply going missing. It was about who wanted them gone. Her phone buzzed. It was Sheriff Nolan's voice, rough from decades of policing and too much black coffee. "Ellison, you might want to come to the station. We've got a visitor asking about the Ward case. Who? You're not gonna believe it." Minutes later, Mara walked into the station lobby, where an elderly man stood hunched near the reception desk. His jacket was clean but worn, his hands trembling slightly. When he lifted his head, Mara recognized him from the file, the only witness, Alden Burrows. "I heard someone's been reopening old ghosts," he said quietly. Mara motioned him to a private room. Once they were seated, she slid the file toward him. "You saw Helen's car. You wrote this." Burrows stared at his own handwriting as if looking at a crime. "I didn't tell the truth," he whispered. "I've carried that lie for 50 years. Then tell the truth now." His eyes moistened. "I didn't see her car going west. I saw men, 3 of them, leading Helen and Jacob toward St. Bridget's before dawn. I wanted to speak up, but you don't understand what the church meant back then, what the men running it were capable of." Mara felt her pulse tighten. "Why speak now?" "Because someone came to my house last night," he said. "Someone who told me to stay quiet, again." The weight of his confession settled heavily between them. The ledger, the false statement, the church's old influence. It was no longer speculation. It was a pattern, and someone alive today still wanted that pattern hidden. Burrows reached into his coat and pulled out a folded slip of paper. "Found this on my porch this morning." Mara opened it. Only 4 words were written in sharp, deliberate strokes. Let the past rot. The chapter closes with Mara pressing the note flat with her fingertips, realizing that the past wasn't rotting at all, it was waking up. And whatever came next would force the entire town to confront what it had buried. The slip of paper Burroughs handed her, "Let the past rot," followed Mara all the way to the tree line that bordered the northern edge of Ashford. The pines stood tall and motionless, the air unusually still for late autumn, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. After Burroughs' confession, the logical next step was obvious. If Helen and Jacob had been taken anywhere that morning in 1974, it was here, to the isolated grounds of St. Brigid's Chapel. The church had been abandoned for decades. Even its name had become more of a warning than a location. People didn't hike this trail, didn't hunt these woods, didn't even speak of the place unless forced. But as the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long stripes of fading gold between the trees, Mara knew she had no choice. Burroughs' story changed everything. It meant the chapel wasn't just a ruin. It was a crime scene, 50 years overdue. She followed the narrow path as pine needles cracked softly under her boots. The deeper she walked, the more the sounds of town life faded away until the world became nothing but wind and memory. She kept replaying Burroughs' words, 3 men. Before dawn. The church meant something back then. The way his voice had trembled wasn't only fear, it was guilt. He had watched something he never should have, and the whole town had paid for that silence. When the trees finally opened into a clearing, Mara saw the chapel for the first time. It sat slumped against the earth like a structure trying to disappear into the ground. The wooden beams were warped, the stone foundation split, and ivy crawled across the roof as if trying to swallow the building whole. Yet despite decades of decay, something about it remained unsettlingly intact, like a relic that refused to fall. Mara approached slowly, feeling the crackle of old dread prickling at her skin. She paused at the threshold, noticing dark scorch marks around the doorframe. Fire damage, but not from a wildfire or natural burn. These were deliberate, controlled, almost symbolic, as if someone had tried to cleanse something. She pushed the door, and it gave way with a groan that echoed through the hollow sanctuary. Broken pews lay scattered in collapsed rows, and the once beautiful stained glass windows had been shattered long ago, leaving only jagged shards that caught the dying light. Dust floated in the still air like restless ghosts. In the center of the chapel floor, beneath a shaft of fading sunlight, lay the remnants of a makeshift altar. Stone slabs stacked unevenly, covered in carved symbols Mara didn't recognize. She knelt beside them, tracing her gloved fingers over the etchings. They were crude but intentional, ritualistic, not religious in any recognizable sense. Something far older or more secretive. She photographed the markings and stood, scanning the room again. Her gaze drifted upward to the balcony where the choir once stood. One of the railing posts had been snapped in half, as if someone had fallen, or been pushed from it. A soft thump echoed behind her. Mara spun, hand reaching instinctively toward her sidearm, but the room was empty. Just the groan of the old building settling into the cold. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the chapel wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. She decided to inspect the back rooms. The hallway was narrow and dust-choked, lined with rotting doors that hung crooked on their hinges. The first room was empty except for a rusted basin. The second was filled with boxes of outdated hymnals, but the third door, the one at the far end, was locked from the outside. That made her stop. Locks belonged on the inside of rooms people wanted to feel safe leaving. Not on rooms meant to keep something, or someone contained. Mara crouched, examining the lock. It was old but sturdy, recently disturbed. Scratches near the latch suggested someone had unlocked and relocked it not long ago. She tried the knob again. Nothing. Solid. She stepped back, lifted her flashlight, and peered through the narrow crack at the bottom of the door. The beam illuminated dusty floorboards, then something that didn't belong here. A strip of fabric. Faded blue cotton, the exact shade Helen Ward was wearing in the photograph from the case file. A chill ran up her spine. She rose quickly and backed away from the door. Every instinct told her she wasn't supposed to find this, not yet, not alone. Burroughs' warning, the burned doorway, the ledger filled with names, it all pointed to one truth. The chapel had been used long after Helen and Jacob disappeared. Someone had returned here, maybe recently. Just as Mara reached the chapel entrance, her phone buzzed. She answered breathlessly. "You need to get back." Sheriff Nolan said, "We've got another problem." "What now?" "A break-in at the archive room. Someone destroyed the Ward file." Mara froze, staring back at the dark silhouette of the chapel. Someone wasn't just hiding the past. They were erasing it, and she was now walking straight into the heart of whatever they feared most. The drive back from the chapel felt longer than it should have. Mara kept glancing in the rear view mirror, half expecting headlights to appear behind her on the empty county road. Whoever had broken into the archives wasn't just covering their tracks. They were accelerating. And the timing was too perfect. She discovers signs of Helen Ward at the chapel, and within the hour, the original file is destroyed. By the time she reached the sheriff's office, the sky had gone completely dark, and the building's exterior lamps flickered weakly against the cold night air. Sheriff Nolan was waiting for her inside, arms crossed, jaw tense. The archive room was a mess, cabinets pried open, folders scattered, and in the center of it all, the Ward family file lay shredded like someone had torn it apart in a panic. But not everything was gone. Nolan gestured to a single object sealed inside an evidence bag on the table. This was the only thing they didn't destroy. Mara stepped closer. It was the ledger, the same one referenced in the redacted 1989 memo she found earlier. The same ledger Burroughs hinted at before fear overtook him. A thick, leather-bound book, worn at the edges and tied shut with a strip of frayed cloth. A shiver passed through her as she picked it up. The leather felt oddly warm, like it had been held recently. She looked at Nolan. "Where did you find it?" "In the back corner," he said. "Whoever broke in dropped it while they were leaving, or maybe they meant to leave it behind. Why would they leave the most incriminating thing?" She murmured. Nolan didn't answer. Mara carried the ledger into the interrogation room. Quieter, sealed, better lighting. Her footsteps echoed across the tile as she sat and slowly untied the cloth. The ledger fell open with a sigh of old paper. Most of the entries were written in tight, sharp handwriting, the kind of script belonging to someone used to keeping records, someone meticulous. Each page listed names, dates, small notations, but no explanations. Mara flipped through, scanning, searching for something that connected to Helen and Jacob. Then she saw it. June 11, 1974 H. Ward/J. Ward marked, her breath hitched. She leaned closer. The word marked was written darker than the others, almost carved into the paper. As if the writer pressed so hard the ink nearly tore through the page. Beneath the names was another line, added later in a shaky hand, taken before dawn. Chapel witness compromised. Mara's stomach tightened. Chapel witness, Burroughs. He had been telling the truth, and someone had known. Someone had returned later to adjust the ledger. Someone who wanted to ensure the event remained perfectly documented and perfectly buried. She kept reading. A few pages later, she found another entry that made her skin crawl. August 1974, cleanup complete. Records moved, silence maintained, silence maintained. That was the theme of Ashford, wasn't it? Not just a culture of keeping quiet, but an organized effort, documented in handwriting, to make sure generations forgot what happened in those woods. As Mara closed the ledger slightly, thinking, she noticed something odd about the back cover. A slight ridge beneath the leather. She pressed her thumb against it, feeling the material flex. A hidden pocket. Her pulse quickened. Carefully, she peeled back the inner lining. A folded paper slipped out, yellowed with age. She opened it, a photograph, Helen Ward, standing outside the chapel, not smiling, not posing, more like she had been caught mid-skip, eyes wide, mouth parted, as if someone had called her name just before the shutter clicked. But the worst part wasn't Helen, it was the man standing half, hidden behind her, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat, face turned away, but his posture radiated familiarity, as if he belonged there. As if he wasn't surprised that a picture was being taken. "Who is that?" Nolan asked from behind her. Mara didn't look up. Someone who wasn't in any witness statements, someone they erased. Her phone buzzed suddenly, sharp in the silence. "Unknown number," she answered cautiously. "Detective Mara." A low voice cut her off. "You need to stop reading from that ledger. You're opening doors that were shut for a reason." Her breath stalled. "Who is this?" A pause. Then a quiet exhale. "You were at the chapel today. You weren't alone." The line went dead. Mara stared at the ledger, its pages still open to the names Helen and Jacob Ward. Someone was watching her. And they were watching the past wake up. Mara didn't sleep that night. The anonymous call replayed in her mind like a warped recording, slow, deliberate, too familiar in tone. She had heard men speak like that before, not threatening, not pleading, but confident. Confident because they believed the past belonged to them. Confident because they were certain no one would ever drag it back into the light. By morning, the sky outside the sheriff's office was pale and washed out, the kind of daylight that made everything look colder than it was. Mara brought the ledger with her, still wrapped in an evidence sleeve. She laid it on her desk like something alive, something that breathed in dust and decades. Sheriff Nolan arrived minutes later, coffee in hand. He looked as though he hadn't slept either. "Any progress?" he asked. Mara tapped the ledger. "If the entries are real, then the church didn't just keep financial records. It kept track of people who were marked, people who were taken. This wasn't a disappearance, it was a system." Nolan leaned against the desk, brow furrowed. But why Helen, why Jacob? They weren't wealthy. They weren't involved in anything shady. "That's exactly why," Mara said quietly. "They were vulnerable." She flipped the ledger open and turned to the back pages again. Names filled the margins, rows and rows of neat handwriting. Most carried short annotations: paid, settled, moved, or the eeriest one of all, returned. Others bore the darker mark, taken before dawn. As she scanned the entries, she noticed a pattern forming, dates clustering between 1968 and 1975. Then something stranger, a symbol, a small, repeated mark beside certain names. It looked like a circle, bisected by a vertical line. "What is that?" Nolan asked, leaning closer. "I don't know," Mara admitted, "but it's beside Helen and Jacob's names too." A sudden thought pulled at her. She reached for the redacted 1989 memo she'd found earlier and unfolded it. In the corner of the page, nearly invisible, was the same symbol, faintly stamped. She breathed in sharply. "This symbol isn't just a note. It's an identifier." "For what?" Nolan asked. She hesitated. "For belonging to something." Nolan stepped back, uneasy. "A group, a sect. You think the church was running something organized?" "Not just a church," Mara said. "A network." She kept reading, turning page after page until she reached a section where entries stopped abruptly. The last page held only 2 words, written far larger than the others: "The Well." Mara angled the ledger under the light, noticing faint indentations behind the ink. Someone had pressed hard enough to leave marks on the next page. Whatever "the well" meant, the writer had considered it important. "Maybe it's a metaphor," Nolan suggested, "or a location, or both," Mara whispered. She remembered the chapel floor, cracked, sunken in places, the boards rotting around a square outline. A covering of some kind, something beneath it, a well. Her breath caught. "Nolan, I think I know where they put the names, not in a ledger, not in a file." "In the church?" he asked. "No," she said slowly. "Under it." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Deputy Ree stepped in, eyes wide. "You need to see this," she said. "Someone reported a disturbance out near Pine Hollow Road, old property line behind the chapel." "What kind of disturbance?" Mara asked. "Someone was digging," Ree replied. "Fresh soil everywhere, and we found tire tracks leading back toward town." Mara exchanged a glance with Nolan. The person who broke into the archives hadn't just been covering history. They were moving toward something. Maybe retrieving, maybe hiding. She grabbed her coat. "Let's go." Minutes later, they were driving through the pines, the tall trees crowding the dirt path like guardians of the past. At the clearing, deputies had already cordoned off a wide patch of disturbed earth. Deep grooves scarred the ground. Someone had been working fast and deliberately. Ree pointed to a mound of freshly turned soil. "We think they were trying to reach something, or remove something." Mara knelt, running her hand across the cold dirt. The ground here was soft, looser than the rest. She dug her fingers in slightly, and hit something harder beneath the surface. Wood. Her heart pounded. Nolan crouched beside her. "What is it?" Mara brushed more soil away, revealing a rotted plank. Carved into the wood, barely visible beneath years of decay, was the same symbol from the ledger, the circle, the line, the mark that tied everything together. Someone had dug here last night because they feared what was buried. Mara looked up, breath unsteady. "This isn't just a site," she whispered. "This is one of the wells, and whatever lay beneath it wasn't meant to be found." The wooden plank lay half-exposed beneath the loose soil, its carved symbol just visible beneath the dirt. Mara stared at it, feeling the weight of something old and deliberate pressing against her chest. Someone had been here hours before, someone who knew exactly what the well concealed, but someone else might know too. As deputies marked off the area and prepared to bring excavation tools, Mara stepped away from the clearing and took a slow breath. The forest felt heavy with expectation, as if the pines themselves were leaning in, listening. Nolan approached beside her. "Whatever was in that well, someone tried to get to it first, or move it," Mara murmured. "Either way, they were scared." Nolan hesitated. "Scared of what we'll find?" She shook her head. "Scared of who still remembers?" That thought settled in her mind like a stone sinking into water. Someone old enough to remember the chapel. Old enough to remember the disappearances, old enough to know what marked meant, and then she thought of Alden Burroughs, the fragile tremble in his voice, the fear in his eyes. He had been the first witness. But maybe not the last. Mara returned to the car and, after a long moment of hesitation, dialed his number. It rang twice. Then a weaker voice answered, strained and breathless. "Detective, I didn't expect to hear from you again. We found something, Mr. Burroughs, near the chapel, something connected to the ledger." A long pause, then a soft exhale. "I knew this day would come." "Did you know about the wells?" she asked gently. Another pause, longer this time, heavier. "I wasn't supposed to," he finally whispered, "but I saw things I shouldn't have, heard things. They called them holding wells. But that was a lie. They weren't for water. They were for names, for people." Mara felt her fingertips go cold. "You mean they kept records underground?" "No," he said. "They kept reminders, objects, things connected to the people they took." His voice cracked. "Tokens, tokens." The idea made her breath falter. "Mr. Burroughs, you knew Helen, didn't you?" Silence, then a small, painful truth. "She used to bring Jacob to my farm. He loved the animals. She was kind. Too kind for this town." Mara closed her eyes. "Why didn't you say something back then?" "Because they warned me." His voice trembled. "3 men, all wearing those dark coats, all tied to St. Bridget's. They told me to keep my mouth shut unless I wanted to join the list. I was a coward, detective." "You were a witness," she said softly. "That isn't cowardice." He didn't respond. Mara pressed gently. "You said you saw 3 men. Did you recognize any of them?" Another pause. This one filled with dread. "One." He breathed. "At least I think so. But I never told anyone. Not even my wife before she passed." "Who was it?" His answer came out as barely a whisper, as if the name itself could summon old ghosts. Reverend Castle. Mara's eyes opened sharply. The name hit her like a blow. Reverend Elias Castle. Long-time leader of the church, respected, beloved, untouchable. He had died 14 years ago, leaving behind a spotless legacy and a town that spoke his name with reverence. But now, he was tied to the Wells, to Helen, to Jacob, to all the marked names in the ledger. Mara tightened her grip on the phone. "Mr. Burroughs, I need to meet with you, today." But Burroughs didn't answer right away, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone frail. "I don't think I have much time left, Detective. Someone was outside my house last night, watching. They know I talked." "Do you feel safe right now?" Mara asked quickly. "No," he whispered, "and if I disappear, don't let them say it was natural. Don't let them bury my part in this." Mara's pulse quickened. "I'm coming to you now." But before she could end the call, Burroughs spoke again, softer, almost resigned. "Detective, the well you found, it's not the only one." The line went dead. Mara stood there in the quiet forest clearing, the phone cold in her hand. One witness already terrified. One name connecting past and present. And now the chilling truth. There were more wells, and the people who created them were not finished yet. Burroughs' final words followed Mara all the way back into town. "It's not the only one." The forest, the ledger, the carved symbol, the freshly dug soil. It was all widening, pulling the case into a darker landscape than she had imagined. But one revelation weighed heavier than the rest. Reverend Elias Castle, a man the town had practically canonized. A man who, if Burroughs was right, had been standing behind Helen Ward on the day she vanished. A man with secrets. By late afternoon, Mara stood outside the old parsonage behind St. Brigid's. The abandoned building seemed to lean into the wind like it was tired of standing guard over decades of silence. The white paint had peeled into curled flakes, revealing the gray boards beneath, and the once vibrant stained glass windows were crusted with grime. Nolan met her at the porch. "You're sure about this?" Burroughs said Castle was involved. Mara replied, "The answers won't be in the chapel, they'll be in the place he controlled." Nolan exhaled and tried the door. Locked but brittle. With one push, the frame gave way, groaning open in defeat. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Dust motes swirled in the thin beams of light that pierced the boarded windows. The furniture was still arranged as if Castle might return any moment. A wooden desk, a faded rug, books lining the shelves in perfect symmetry. "It's like a museum," Nolan muttered. "No," Mara said quietly. "Museums preserve truth." She moved deeper inside, scanning the walls, the floorboards, the corners where dust lay too evenly. Something felt staged, too neat for a man supposedly keeping normal church records. Then she noticed a small portrait above the fireplace. Castle, smiling faintly, his eyes dark and unreadable. Beneath the frame, the wallpaper bulged slightly, as if the wall had swallowed something it wasn't meant to. Mara stepped closer. "This doesn't look right." She pressed her hand against the bulge, hollow. Nolan joined her, frowning. Hidden space. Maybe. Together, they removed the portrait. Behind it was a seam, thin but visible. Nolan fetched a knife from his belt and slid the blade along the edge. The panel shifted, a hidden door. Mara's pulse quickened. "Help me with this." With effort, they pulled the panel aside, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. A faint, earthy smell drifted upward. Old paper, damp air, and something else beneath it. Something metallic. Nolan switched on his flashlight. Castle had a basement, but the church records never mention one. That's why he liked it, Mara murmured. Step by step, they descended. The walls tightened around them, lined with rough stone. The air grew heavier, and when they reached the bottom, the beam of Nolan's flashlight fell across the room. Mara felt her breath leave her. A long wooden table stood in the center, covered with stacks of papers, handwritten letters and objects sealed in jars, buttons, scraps of fabric, a child's hair ribbon. Against the far wall, rows of shelves held more jars, each labeled with dates that spanned nearly a decade. Tokens? Just like Burroughs said, but what froze Mara entirely was the far corner of the room, a cabinet, dusty yet locked with a rusted chain. Above it, carved into the wood, was the same symbol from the ledger. The circle, the vertical line, the mark of the taken. Nolan whispered, "Dear God." Mara approached the cabinet and tugged at the chain. It rattled but wouldn't budge. She looked around the room, searching for tools, and spotted a small metal key hanging on a nail near the shelves. She grabbed it, hands trembling, and returned. The key fit. The chain fell away. Mara opened the cabinet. Inside were folders, dozens of them, each one stamped with a name. Some she recognized from the ledger. Others she didn't, but when she reached the second row, one file stopped her cold. Helen Ward. Her fingertips hovered over it. "Take it out," Nolan urged. She did carefully. The folder was thicker than she expected. Inside were notes in Castle's handwriting, photographs of Helen around town, and detailed observations written like case studies rather than pastoral care. The last page held a single line, "Prepared for transfer." Mara felt sick. He tracked her, watched her, as if she were property. Nolan rubbed his forehead. This wasn't a religious man. This was something else. Mara kept flipping until she reached the final document in the folder. A small creased receipt for lumber, purchased days before the Wards disappeared. The delivery address made her pulse stumble. Pine Hollow, the very ground where they found the well. Behind her, something creaked. A sound from the stairwell. Nolan turned sharply. "Did you hear that?" Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down. Mara quietly closed the folder, her heart thundering. Someone else knew about the room. Someone who didn't want them in it. The storm outside had thinned to a restless drizzle by the time Reeves and Clara returned to the chapel's undercroft, but the tension between them crackled like a live wire. The hidden room behind the pastor's study had revealed more than either expected. Maps, letters, and the ledger fragments pointing to a place mentioned repeatedly yet never explained. The foundation block. Reeves turned the phrase over like a stone in his palm, certain it carried weight beyond metaphor. Clara ran her hand across the damp stone wall, her flashlight beam trembling slightly. "It keeps appearing in the files," she murmured. "First in the pastor's notes, then in the ledger, and now on that map. Whatever it is, they built everything around it." Reeves knelt beside the discolored patch in the floor where the room's crates had once rested. Beneath the dust lay a square outline, faint yet unmistakable. "If this is what I think," he said, brushing debris aside, "the pastor wasn't hiding a room. He was guarding an entrance." They set to work, clearing the stone tiles piece by piece. The air thickened with the scent of wet earth and age-old mildew. At last Clara's fingers caught on a recessed iron loop, rusted nearly to dust. Reeves helped her pry it upward, and with a groaning thud, the square of stone lifted to reveal a narrow shaft descending into darkness. Cold, metallic air rose from below, carrying the faint smell of stagnant water. "This wasn't built as storage," Clara whispered. "It's a vault." Reeves tested the ladder's integrity before climbing down. Each rung vibrated with centuries. Old fatigue but held. Clara followed, and their flashlights revealed a chamber no larger than a bedroom, its walls lined with carved symbols matching those from the ledger's margin notes. At the center sat a single stone block, smoother and paler than the walls around it. Reeves approached it slowly. "This is it, the foundation block." Carved into the slab were names. Some they recognized from the ledger, others had been lost to time. But toward the bottom, Reeves found a set of initials that tightened his throat. "C.M." He muttered, "Clara, your mother." Clara froze. The color drained from her face as she leaned in. tracing the initials with trembling fingertips. "She disappeared when I was 8. I never connected her to this town." Reeves placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Whatever happened here, she wasn't just a victim. She was part of something the pastor wanted buried." Clara inhaled sharply. "Then we dig deeper. We find out why her name is carved into the block." Before Reeves could answer, a soft, rhythmic tapping echoed from somewhere above them. Slow, deliberate, unmistakably human. They looked at each other. Someone else knew they were here, and that meant the next step wouldn't wait. The tapping grew louder, carrying a warning neither of them could ignore, pushing them toward a truth far darker than anything they had uncovered so far. The tapping above Reeves and Clara faded as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind an uneasy silence that followed them long after they climbed out of the vault. By the time they stepped back outside, night had fully settled over Alder Creek, but their minds were already turning toward the one place every lead had been pointing to: Brackenridge. Once a small settlement on the north edge of the forest, now nothing more than a scar on outdated maps and the whispered memory of those old enough to recall it. Clara tightened her coat against the cold wind rolling down from the hills. "If the pastor was hiding names," she said quietly, "and my mother's initials were among them, then Brackenridge isn't just a location. It's a reason." Reeves nodded, though the weight of the discovery pressed heavier on him than he let show. "The ledger entries mention a transfer point, and that stone block. Those names weren't carved as memorials. They were records. Brackenridge is where those names were last seen alive." They drove through the dark, the forest pressing close on either side, branches clawing at the car like skeletal fingers. When they reached the rusted gate marking the old township boundary, Reeves killed the engine. Beyond the fence lay the remnants of Brackenridge: collapsed cabins, splintered beams, and chimneys standing like gravestones for a town long abandoned. The only sound was the wind rattling through empty window frames. Clara's flashlight swept across the debris. "It looks dead," she murmured, "like nothing ever lived here, or like something made sure no trace of what happened survived." Reeves replied. They walked deeper into the ruins, following the faint path indicated on the pastor's map. The moon slid from behind a cloud, illuminating a half-buried foundation where a large building once stood. Reeves knelt, brushing aside the dirt, charred wood, melted metal, signs of an old fire, intense, deliberate. "Arson," he said. "Someone burned this place down from the inside." Clara moved beside him, her gaze narrowing to erase evidence. Reeves nodded. "And likely the people who tried to expose whatever the pastor was protecting." Her breath hitched. "If my mother came here, she might have known something." As they circled the foundation, Clara's flashlight caught on a fragment of concrete jutting from the soil. She crouched, fingers tracing the rough surface, stopping when she found a faint marking, a triangle inside a circle, the same symbol carved around the foundation block beneath the chapel. Reeves exhaled slowly. Same faction, same ritual. Clara swallowed. Then this wasn't just a town, it was a gathering site. They both stood silent for a moment, the cold settling deeper around them. Then, from the far ridge, a flicker of movement caught Reeves's eye. Brief, almost imperceptible, but human. Clara noticed it too. "We're not alone." Reeves stepped forward, but the figure vanished into the tree line, leaving only the faint echo of snapping twigs. Whoever they were, they had been watching Brackenridge long before Reeves and Clara arrived. And now they knew the investigation had reached the place where everything had begun, and where nothing had truly ended.